Hi, welcome to the Connection Podcast. I am Lauren Dry, also known as the Connection Catalyst. Connection and this podcast for me is personal. As a driven professional, I found myself an expert in all things work and business, but it was at home that I really needed clarity and ease. After finally finding it, one marriage breakdown and one marriage reset later, and finally discovering what really works to have connection in modern relationships using science, simplicity, and soul, our signature program, Rise into Regulation, was born. That's giving so many others in modern driven relationships back clarity and ease for good. On the podcast today, we're going to dive deep together on all things relationships, business, identity, and leadership. Clarity and ease is at the heart of it all, and we're so happy to be with you so that you can have what you need in connection, mind, body, and soul, too. I would like to welcome onto the podcast today a wonderful guest. Her name is Kristina, and we are going to cover something a little bit stretchy. Now, on this podcast today, we are going to be covering something that has touched almost every person who I have been in contact with, whether it's in their youth, whether it's in previous relationships, or in their current relationship, and that is infidelity. What is a little bit more of a taboo topic is infidelity when the wife or the woman is the one who has maybe stepped out, maybe made a mistake, whether it's emotional infidelity or actual infidelity. And so I want to hold anyone who's listening today with so much tenderness. This is a sensitive topic for both sides of the fence, as you would say. But on the Connection podcast, it's important that we hold space for not only the topics that are, let's just say, easy or more comfortable to sit with, particularly when we have statistics like this. What we do know, and the statistics that we are aware of, is that in the US, approximately 13% of married women report having experienced infidelity in terms of being the one who instigated it, compared to about 20% of married men. Other surveys actually suggest, though, that it's more of a 23% general infidelity rate across all relationship types, including dating, long-term, and married partnerships. And women are actually more likely to engage in emotional affairs, while men tend towards more of the actual act of infidelity. In fact, one study found that 57% of wives who admitted experiencing and being a part of infidelity reported strong emotional involvement without the act itself. So when it comes to covering this topic, we hold so much tenderness for whoever has been involved on either side of the fence because it's an important topic to cover. How does this happen? Why does this happen? And most importantly as well, when something like this happens, how do we move forward? How does a person who has been involved in infidelity walk forward into grace, into growth, and step away from that old story, whether that means repair, whether that means working through what's happening and moving forward together in their existing relationship? So we are holding space for such an important, stretchy topic today. And we're going to be discussing this with Kristina. So Kristina is a coach and host of Intimacy After Infidelity, a top 2.5% globally ranked podcast. She works with women navigating the aftermath of infidelity, guiding them to release shame, rebuild trust in themselves, and reconnect with God in a deeply personal way. Her whole being approach, mind, heart, soul, and body, creates a path for real and lasting change. She's also a mum of 4, passionate about helping women create emotional and spiritual homes they never want to abandon again. And my hope is that no matter where you are in your own story, something here offers clarity, compassion, and even just the reminder that healing is possible. I'd love to welcome to the podcast today, Kristina. Thank you so much for being with us.
Yes, thank you for having me. Yeah, such a joy to be able to get my voice out because I know this is a topic around the world, not just the United States, not just Australia, but it really is women all over the globe.
We are so happy to be with you here on the Connection podcast. And I'd love to start off, first of all, by hearing a little bit more about your story, why this topic is so important to you, and how you found yourself in this work.
As you could probably guess, it hits a personal chord. It is my experience that I was married and then found myself having an affair. And to just tell you the end of the story, when I was done, had confessed to my husband, was really serious about my healing, what I found was that all of the resources I would Google, what are ways for people to heal after infidelity? All the resources were worded in a way that the husband had stepped out and the wife needed to heal from the betrayal. I thought, well, I'm sure I could learn a little bit from that. But what that did was further heap on the shame of, wow, I am the only woman on the face of the planet who has ever done something like this. So, to backtrack, what was this thing that I did? It all started, I would say, early on in marriage. Now, looking back, there are so many patterns that I could see early on that I wish we had addressed the first year or two of marriage. But it kind of came to a perfect storm where both my husband and I were working really a job and a half. We were just very busy, did not make time, did not have time for each other. And to complicate matters, we had two miscarriages back to back. And I was young and naive, and I did not know, I was not aware that even after a miscarriage, a woman could possibly have issues with like postpartum depression. And so again, hindsight is 2020. I could look back and say, "Oh, that's why I felt out of character. I felt like I was watching my life play in a movie before me. I felt very disconnected. I was doing things that were just out of character for myself, or I was wanting to do things." So all of this was the perfect storm. No connection at home, no emotional connection, not having words to express what I wanted or needed. And then, yeah, on top of these things happening in my body that I couldn't explain either, I was working at a restaurant in my town. And just through a series of events, it was like once a snowball started of just receiving attention from guys, the snowball just kept going. There was no stopping that. So it ended up that I did, first of all, become emotionally invested in this guy. And then it did turn physical. And overall, I explain it in a 7-year period, like the 7-year season of having this affair. And it wasn't all rainbows and butterflies. There were times that I definitely tried to cut contact, say, I'm done. This isn't right. This doesn't line up with my values. This isn't actually who I am. But man, then you start talking about things like addictions and trauma bonding and all of the patterns that just came to the surface and kept me stuck in this relationship. So it was about a 7-year period. And then through a turn of events, I would say that the Lord God really got a hold of my heart and was able to make a night and day transformation in my life. But I'll pause there. So if you had any questions about the heart of the story.
Yeah, that's a real journey. And it sounds like you've been through all of the emotions and all of the range of experiences there in terms of what it means to self soothe, to seek support, but not having a structure there to be able to obtain the support you needed that was going to be beneficial to you and matched with the life that you were seeking. I have a curiosity there. Why do you think that is? When we place that curiosity around you having, and so many women who are in this situation where things aren't great and they have challenging, very real and heartbreaking situations that they're navigating through, trauma patterns and unhealed grief, things that they're trying to navigate. What is your perception now after being through all of that, all of the ups and the downs, as to why that particular choice to lean into a relationship that was outside of your marriage? What was happening for you there as to that being the coping skill, the support system that seemed on the surface or at that time to be the choice that was available, the choice that seemed to be accessible to you throughout that period?
Such a good and fair question because after the fog had cleared and I was able to look back on it, I was able to see, man, we all do cope in different ways, whether it's a food addiction or shopping or a substance of some kind. And it was interesting that I was using words like addiction because I didn't know how else to describe it. And it
Mhm.
really was, we all cope. Like you said, the coping mechanism, we
Right.
all cope in
Yeah.
different kinds of ways. And so, yeah, for me, I slowly learned the vocabulary of feeling seen and truly known, and even words like cherished and valued. It was interesting because I feel like my self-esteem was always intact. Like I knew that I was a smart, capable, strong woman. You know, if somebody said, "Oh, do you feel unlovable?" No, I know I'm lovable. Like I'm a good person. I'm confident in myself. However, I was not receiving any of that back, specifically from my partner at home. Now, mind you, when I talk about this kind of 7-year period, I also I'm trying to do the math really quick. I birthed 3 of my 4 children during that time as well. And so you can imagine the pressures at home are increasing. Now I have young babies back to back, and I was working at the time. I was an elementary teacher, and there was a lot going on. And so I am a very good task manager. I can get stuff done. And what I didn't realize was that I never had a safe space to just land and to just be. And so that's what this guy ended up providing for me was just a space where I could go take a deep breath. I didn't have to perform and do things. I was not achieving or striving for him. Like it was somebody that would see me, love me, value me, cherish me, tell me I was doing a really good job. Somebody who asked me how my day was going, you know, what thing happened today? And so there was just that friendship there that had just eroded at home. Now, of course, I can also look back and say, "Oh, there are some similar patterns growing up. You know, how is my relationship with my dad and things like that." So, yes, very fascinating to find a thread and follow it all the way back. You know, it wasn't
Yeah.
just a marriage
Yeah.
thing, but it does go back.
Yeah. And I'm so glad that you mentioned that because something that I have noticed and seen in so many couples and people who have come to Rise as well, something that really fascinated me first off was how evenly split the experience was around people who were coming for support. When you first step into this work, there is a large expectation that by and large it's the man, it's not the woman. And in my line of work, in my experience, that's not what I'm seeing. I'm seeing a very even split. And something that I have noticed with these couples, with these people, these individuals who are the person who has, let's say, who stepped out of their marriage, whether it's emotionally or physically, there's a pattern around, and I'd love to get your take on this, but for many of the people who have been involved in these situations, there is a pattern or a tendency before they've done the work to disconnect from or distance themselves from the ability to sit with discomfort. And it's interesting that you used the word coping, addiction, and I'm definitely not going to put all of these things in one basket, but there is a flavor, there is a thread there around what happens when you have someone who is very, very good at performing, very, very good at, let's say, creating a story, creating an image that makes other people comfortable and that they're very, very rewarded for. And yet there may have been a gap. whether it's in childhood or at another point in time, there seems to be, and this is a common thread, not for everyone, but it's a very, very common thread around there not having been safety created internally yet around the ability to sit with discomfort. And what I'd noticed at the beginning of the journey for so many people who have instigated that rupture in the relationship or have stepped out or have been involved in an affair is that when they are trying to repair, if they are trying to repair, or even that if they're just trying to repair their own relationship with their own selves, the shame and the ability to almost even look at the shame is overwhelming. And the first block in order to navigate, whether it's repair or self repair, is so very often that ability to look at the mistake or look at the guilt without it being interlinked and intermeshed with identity. So, identity is shame. I am bad as opposed to I did something bad. And so the cycle continues. If I can't look at my mistake, if I can just only move forward, things are fine now, I've made the decision, I'm going to be good, then that disconnect tends to linger. And then what I have observed is that without that support to be able to reset that pattern, then it comes up in other ways. Addictive patterns, dissociation patterns, even just long-term disconnection patterns where that wound never gets repaired. And even two people with the best of intentions looking to repair their relationship, that thread of distance, resentment on both sides tends to linger. So it's really, really important to first off, before we focus on healing that, is acknowledge that pattern underneath of discomfort and the inability and the lack of opportunity that so many have had to be able to learn how to sit in discomfort and seek healthy support. So I'd love to get your take on that.
Oh, that's so good. Yeah, I would say you mentioned even like the kind of person that can find themselves in this place. Maybe like a people pleaser, someone who's very good at performing. And yes, I have found that a lot of the women I talk with are those high achievers. Maybe they are in a leadership position in their job, they run a business, they have people under them. And I found that fascinating when I started to observe that. And I think there's multiple reasons, but one being that, yes, they know how to get the job done. And they're so good at doing all of their things at work. They have people who respect them. And then what happens when they go home and that same level of respect is not there? And so it just doesn't help the dynamic when they can go to work and they get that attention. Their affection bucket is getting filled by other people, even unintentionally, but it drives the disconnect that's at home then. And yeah, the ability to sit with the discomfort and the shame and the identity, those are all questions that I had to sit with. Now, I mentioned that I was working, I was having babies back to back. And then there did come a season where I had my fourth baby in November. It was the following October, so about 11 months later, that I went on a retreat. It was going to be a business retreat, but that was really what I believe was God's hand of getting my attention. God really got a hold of my heart there at that retreat. And that is where I was surrounded by some really safe people, some coaches that were able to call out this shame and this discomfort and give me some words and a safe space to sit in that. They were the first people on the planet that I had ever poured the story out to. Up until that point, nobody else on the planet knew what was going on for me. So then that night that I got home from that retreat was the night that I confessed to my husband, told him, "Hey, had an affair. It's up to you how we move forward, but I needed to let you know about this." So in that next season, the three of my older children were going to school. I was home with a baby who was still taking 2 naps a day. So I had plenty of time, at least in the morning part, to have this quiet time to ask these questions. So I remember sitting with my journal and asking that basic, who am I now that I'm walking out of this? where does that leave me? And again, like I mentioned earlier, that reinforcement of no Christian woman has ever done something like this. Okay, maybe even if they had a one night stand, they've never done something this bad that I've done. And so I really did have to sit with that. Who am I now? And yeah, is it that I have done something wrong, or is something really wrong with me? Am I the problem, that something's inherently broken with me? So sitting in that discomfort was definitely something that I learned, and even being able to take responsibility in a healthy way. So I was able to look at the situation and grieve my choices, to say, I absolutely could have made different choices. Now I can see where things went wrong. And yeah, maybe I could have done X, Y, and Z differently. That's on me. I do take responsibility. And yeah, now, like, look at the mess that my husband and I are in because of my choices. So it was very uncomfortable, and I had to allow that space to be. It was about 6 or 7 weeks of, I remember we'd put the kids to bed at night, and then it was like, "Okay, are we gonna have another heavy conversation tonight?" And when we would get tired of having really heavy conversations, we'd say, "Let's play a board game just so that we can, like, spend some time together, but take a break from just the heaviness." So, yeah, I got really good at sitting in uncomfortable situations for a while, but yeah,
Yeah.
but dealing with the shame and the identity and rebuilding that from the ground up.
Yeah. I'm curious, what happened for you and what was the turning point for you around coming and having that conversation with your husband? What was happening internally for you where not only the benefit outweighed the risk, but the moment in time happened where it became a necessity? I'd love to explore that exact moment where the trajectory of your current reality and your future reality changed.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, so like I mentioned, up to that point, I had not told anybody, which is actually a shame because I grew up in a church, and I mean, a really great church, great people. But what
Mhm.
happened was over those years, I would think through different women there. And again, great, respectable women. But I thought to myself, they wouldn't know what to do with me. Like, they wouldn't
Yeah.
know how to hold this story, or they're gonna tell me to do something that I don't want to do. I'm not ready for that. And when I use the word safe people, like, even emotionally safe, that I feel like they could hold a really heavy story like that. So felt like I had exhausted my list of local options, and at the time, I was in a network marketing business. So I started working with a couple coaches, just network marketing coaches, and they were hosting a retreat. At the time, I was finishing my master's degree. And I said, "Hey, this retreat is right after I finish. This is going to be my graduation present to myself." And as I got to know these coaches and the guest speaker that they were bringing, I knew that if the opportunity presented itself, this would be a safe group of people to just, get their input on, hypothetically, if I have a situation going on. I was not prepared for what I was walking into. But sure enough, I arrived, my plane landed to get to the beach house that we were staying at. And I'm already like, okay, let's dive into some business strategy. And I don't remember what I said, but the whole story just came pouring out of me. Little did I know that I was actually the only paying client to be at that retreat. And so it was kind of like God had orchestrated that's how I see it. God had orchestrated this whole thing for me to get me alone with these safe women. And so the rest of the weekend, we held the schedule very loosely. That things that they had prepared to present, we still walked through that. But there was a lot of space for, okay, what does Kristina need? What kind of conversations do we need to have to get her moving forward? So by the end of the weekend, it was agreed that, hey, out of respect for your husband, out of respect for your marriage, we don't know how your husband's going to respond. Is he going to call for divorce tomorrow? Is he going to want to separate? Is he going to want to stay and try to repair? We have no idea how he's going to respond, but we were all in agreement that it would be the right thing to do to at least have the conversation with him and give him that chance. So,
Yeah.
so that was my turning point. So I blocked the number of the guy that I had been talking with. And I knew at that point, I knew this is not what I want long term. Even if I do get divorced, it's not like I'm going back to him. This is not in alignment with who I am and what my values are. And so I knew it was time to end things. I just needed the help to get there.
And I think that there's something so powerful with what you just said there around not in alignment with who I am and what my values are. I think that we so often, if we've ever made a mistake or ever struggling, no matter what the mistake is or what the struggle is, what we let go of first, what tends to be released first, is our vision of ourselves, our identity, and our perception of who we believe that we are. Because so often, with anyone in this generation, the way that we were raised, through no judgment or criticism of the generation before us, by and large, again, there are patterns with every generation, was if your behavior is good, you are a good person. If your behavior is bad, you are a bad person. And not that the generation before us would ever have explicitly said that those words, but without that roadmap around how to communicate and navigate shame, navigate discipline. Discipline should be discipleship, not punishment. There's so many patterns there around what happens when we make a mistake. And as that generation grew into adults, what can tend to happen is if that pattern is really, really ingrained, when a mistake is made, it feels like we have to let go of our identity. No one will look at me the same. No one will care for me the same. Only the other person who is as guilty as I am can support me from here on in. I am alone. And if I even look at the mistake I've made or talk to the mistake I've made, who I am as a person and my identity is going to shift so greatly that there's no recovery. I will be abandoned in every sense of the word. I will be shamed in every sense of the word, ostracized in every sense of the word. So I think what's really, really important is to pause and do two things. First, acknowledge the wound that can happen around when we self abandon that decision or that mistake. I think there's a sliding scale. There's a sliding scale around what counts as infidelity according to not only your own morals and values individually, to what you decide on as a couple. Each relationship is different and each person's definition is different. By and large, we can talk about what, let's just say in inverted commas, what those rules should be. But what's much, much more important is examining and having clarity around where those lines are internally, most importantly, so that we can identify what it looks like to make a mistake, first and foremost, not only what the mistake looks like at the beginning, but how to navigate that and seek support so that shame and blocking seeking support is not the very first precursor to the avalanche and the ongoing continuing landslide of, okay, now I'm in too deep. This is where I am. This is what happens. So I have a question for you and a curiosity after exploring that dynamic. What happens when we feel like we're torn? We have to choose between coping and choosing a tool or a coping mechanism that maybe others might disagree with versus staying with and staying in alignment with and embracing our values and staying in alignment with our values. I have a curiosity there because on the surface, what it can look like to some people is seeking comfort and the only version of comfort that's available to me at the risk of drowning without this person who seems to be, or this coping skill seems to be the only person who gets me or coping mechanism or coping skill that is getting me through this impossible time. That seems to feel like, okay, I have to self-soothe and abandon everyone else, versus, okay, I've decided who I am and these are my values and this is how I show up in my marriage, but it's at the cost of my own sanity, my own ability to self-soothe and be supported and be loved and be able to have that ability to feel safe. So it seems like a choice between self-abandonment versus abandoning everyone else. And I'm curious, as we navigate those murky waters, about your own experience. We've discussed these absolutely heartbreaking and really challenging personal moments in time that deserved safety, love, care, attention, friendship, and that for whatever reason didn't feel available to you at the time. I'm curious if this awareness had been available to you about that push pull dynamic, abandon others versus abandon self, and this story that we can create for ourselves that we can, if we perform well enough, you can have both and no one will be hurt. And that happens for so many people, no matter what the coping skill is. I'm curious, with the knowledge that you have now and the awareness that you have now around how shame blocks us from more complex and nuanced problem solving and creates this narrative in this story that it's self-abandonment or other abandonment. What do you believe that this situation would have happened if you had felt like there would have been a more nuanced and complex way to seek support and obtain that feeling of validation, friendship, support, community without finding yourself in the situation that you were in with this other person?
Yeah, so many things that could have happened differently. Actually, it was even just recently, I was in a counseling session and we were back to the early season of like the miscarriages and friendships and things like that. And so it was even just recently where it was brought up again, like that's a real bummer that you didn't have friends really show up for you even in that season of loss. And I had just never given myself permission to grieve even that before. It was just always a matter of fact of, yeah, that's my story. But no way am I shifting blame and saying, oh, it's because others didn't show up for me that I went this way. Not shifting blame at all, but just interesting to observe to say, huh, I wonder if things would have been different if there had been the different levels of friendship, community, support. And I do remember, I believe it's after the second miscarriage, that was when the postpartum depression really hit. And I remember talking with some coworkers who had also struggled with infertility. And I remember talking with them and saying, it's so weird. I feel like I need something, but I don't know what. I'm happy to ask someone for help if I know what to ask for. And I felt crazy even saying that. But again, at that time, I just didn't have the vocabulary and I didn't have anyone peeling back the curtain to come sit with me in the trench. I think that's really powerful because sometimes people will think, oh, I don't want to get in their business. I don't want to be nosy and try to pry and get in their business. But I've said it was almost like I was drowning and somebody saw me and said, "Oh, I can't throw them a life raft. That's none of my business. I don't want to pry. Maybe they're just out swimming." And here I was like drowning saying, "Somebody please help, but I don't know what to ask for here." So could things have been different in the friend and community sense? Sure, totally. Now, it's interesting as you broke down the difference between like self-abandonment or abandoning others. I did self-abandon in a couple ways. Of course, just having an affair in and of itself was not something I ever imagined I would walk into. But on top of that, and this is true of the women that I work with, sometimes we find ourselves with a person that we would love to spend the rest of our life with. And this was the perfect guy. And so then it's really heartbreaking to walk away from that because it felt so perfect. There's another group of women though, and this was the one I fell in, to where we find ourselves with somebody that's totally opposite. what we would ever want. If I had a list of these are all the things that a perfect husband would be for me, he didn't check any of those boxes. Maybe one because he knew how to love me and care for me, but our lifestyles were very different. And so I abandoned myself in that way also to say, now I find myself in a relationship with a guy that I would have never been in a relationship with this guy under normal circumstances. So that's interesting to process through. And then on the flip side, what happens with other people abandoning everyone else? I approach this a little bit differently than how I hear other relationship coaches talk about the work that they do. I try to stay really clear away from talking about repairing in the marriage because I
Mm,
believe that the woman in my shoes, has so much healing that needs to happen for her first. If
mm,
there's any hope of the marriage getting repaired, she has so much work that she needs to do. Like we talked about, the shame, the identity, sitting in the discomfort, all of those things. Once she can do that, then she'll be in a much healthier state to navigate other relationships, whether it's her marriage or friendships or whatever. I refer to that as coming home to yourself and coming home in all of the different ways, physically, spiritually, if faith and religion is part of that, in your heart, your emotions, and also your mind. One thing I didn't mention yet was that I did go through several years of like counseling and therapy, and it was so good. There were many good things that came out of there, but I realized that it did keep me stuck in my head for a long time. And
mm.
there were other parts of me that needed healing and attention as well. And yeah, so we seek healing for the whole self, the whole being, then we'll be able to be more present for the relationships in our lives as well.
Yeah. And I think that there's something so important about this topic around compassion, and it's difficult to it almost feels like taboo to mention it. How exploring compassion for the person who initiates an affair. It almost seems like a taboo thing to
Mhm.
discuss. I think what is so often discounted though is the fact that in these situations the affair, the wound, the rupture aside, something, some hidden pattern created a doorway for this coping tool, this coping skill to seem okay. And
Mhm.
we can, I think that something that has been done and something that we are all familiar with is judgment. Yep, that's bad. So bad. It's all bad. Person is bad. Both people who did their thing, bad. And something that I have noticed is how easy it is, how popular it is, and how pervasive it is to paint situations like this as black and white and
Mhm.
scratch out the problem and move on. The challenge that I find with that is that, like any relationship challenge, like any personal growth challenge, like any internal wound, like any trauma pattern, our ability to heal and our ability to step out of these patterns and not repeat the same cycle is
Mhm.
directly blocked and directly correlated to our relationship with shame. The deeper the shame, the more distant we are from solution. Even if that solution is acknowledgement and grace and healthy holding space for the reality of what has happened, even if that's just to listen to the other person's experience with enough room and patience to say, hey, it's okay for you to have your reality around your grief and your pain, particularly because I'm the one who has, for lack of a better word, who has caused this, who has
Mhm.
created this dynamic. And so often people who have been the instigators, that inability because of the lack of internal grace, the lack of the ability to seek support, even if they can acknowledge the mistake, sitting in that difficult place of holding space and allowing the other person to experience their grief and their pain seems to compound the situation itself. because that internal shame, that version of their own reality, prevents them from being able to hold space and move on and prevent this from happening in the current relationship or in any other relationships. And prevent this from happening, that by definition, I mean by dissociating from themselves, by seeking unhealthy coping skills or habits, by stepping outside of their values, by hiding their feelings and papering over the cracks. So I'm curious, what you mentioned there were some really powerful words around feeling like you were drowning and people were much more comfortable with allowing the story, allowing the respect, keeping their distance, not wanting to interfere. And I think that this is a common dynamic for anyone who is dealing with grief. Grief is a horrific, heartbreaking, overwhelming, debilitating emotion that so many people can experience throughout their life, not only through the loss of a loved one or miscarriage, but grief of the loss of a relationship, the loss of their perception of what a relationship was supposed to look like. Grief can come in many forms. And the challenge that we face today is that there's no safe language by and large. Look, if you look into it, if people have the ability to go deep enough and sit with their own discomfort enough around what grief is, there are so many tools to be able to support someone who looks like they are grieving, whether it's, let's say, for example, someone who's grieving multiple miscarriages. Let's say, if we go really deep, some of the most horrific losses, the loss of a child as well. And not to say that there's a comparison, you have a full spectrum of what grief looks like. And a mother at any stage experiencing that, it's horrific. And for so many people, just being able to step into that space where someone has an overwhelming life situation that seems insurmountable to even touch on, um, there just doesn't seem, in by and large in society in general, a toolkit to be able to navigate holding space for people who are dealing with grief, dealing with the really messy stuff, people who are navigating infidelity, without almost getting enmeshed or getting caught, or that stress and that anxiety about saying and doing the wrong thing and making it worse. So I'm curious, from your perspective on the other side of the fence, someone who has experienced grief and the complexity of being in a really complex values minefield for others, because it can bring up, and I think that this is the fear for so many who have navigated grief in their own way in their own lives, bumping up against people who are going through really hard things. It can bring up a lot in our own selves. It reminds us of times where our own pain has been insurmountable. Holding space for others, there's that unconscious fear. If I ask them how they're going, if I try to hold space, I'm almost going to get dragged into my own pain, or I'm going to say the wrong thing and make it worse. So often people say nothing at all. In your perspective, when you were deep in grief and deep in the pain, or deep in even your own navigating what the balance between grace and shame looked like for you, what would you have wished that someone had said to you, or in a way that allowed a little bit of that heaviness to be lifted? What do you wish, or what would you recommend that people say in those situations or do in those situations to be able to create a little room, not only to support the other person or give permission or approve of the other person's behavior or actions or anything like that, but just to create a little space and a little room for the other person to step into their own accountability and self-reflection, and also realize that grace and blame, they don't have to be opposite sides of the spectrum. They don't have to go hand in hand. You can offer other people grace and the ability to self-reflect without condoning or becoming enmeshed with their own experience, particularly around grief and things like that as well. So I'm curious what comes up for you around that.
Yeah. As you're processing all of that, I am thinking of one particular friend that I spent a lot of time with during those years. And She is what I would call a safe friend. There was a long season where I was not ready to tell her what I was doing. And so during those years, so after I took a break from teaching, after I'd had several kids and I stayed home, we would go to the local gym together and we'd go swimming or whatever. But that was our time to just talk with each other. And often the conversations went towards marriage. And then even our husbands became friends and they would come over for weekly dinner and game night and the kids would play together. And so it wasn't that she was in my business asking prying questions, anything like that. But it was just a long season of having somebody interested in me and just asking curious questions, and then also having them in my home. And so she was able to reflect to me. Just one example, if there were times when maybe my husband didn't talk to me in the most respectful tone of voice, she was able to bring that up in conversation later and just very kindly, very graciously say, "Hey, how did that make you feel when that situation happened?" And I remember one time saying, "Oh, I didn't think anything of it. I thought that was normal. That's just how he talked to me." And she said, "Oh, that's interesting because I was a little uncomfortable with that. That sounded a little
Mm.
disrespectful." And so it just it brought in a new perspective because I think what happened for me was in all these different situations, yeah, very complex pieces of the story, but I only knew what was normal for me. I didn't know that there were other
Mm.
options out there until somebody else came into my home and into my life and then just got curious about it. And
Mm.
so again, there was no judgment. There was no telling me what to do. "Hey, he shouldn't have done that. You need to do this." Nothing like that. She was just living life with me. And for both of us, we were able to ask good questions to each other. And so then when my story did come out that I was ready to share what had been happening behind the scenes all those years, she was able to say, I could read between the lines sometimes. I knew, even though you didn't
Mm.
tell me the whole story, I was around enough to know that there was some other stuff going on." So I'll just say we all need a Sarah in our lives, somebody that would just
Mm.
be there. So it's not about having the right words, like with a miscarriage or a loss of anything. It doesn't have to be having the right words and the right timing, and I have to do all this stuff. For me, it was more about just having a presence and somebody being there that I
Mm.
knew anytime I needed her, I could send a text message and just a presence, just somebody to be there. And like I said, to sit in the trenches with me. She didn't have to
Mm.
know the whole story, but just somebody that could see me and whatever information I was ready to bring to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that we say so often in Rise into Regulation is the opposite of disconnection is not connection, it's curiosity. And when we unpack that, what that looks like is not trying to force things, not trying to perform, not trying to force anything. It's just creating a little room to get curious about the other person's reality, get curious about perhaps what we didn't know before. And I think we can so easily underestimate the power of just creating a little room. And I think in so many marriages, in so many relationships, in so many friendships, there is a fear that if we ask the correct question, if we create the room, if we create curiosity, then we are creating approval, we are creating permission. And this is in so many dynamics, particularly into relationships in a marriage. If I ask what the other person's reality is, then that's taking away power from my own reality, my own experience. And I think that there's so much to be said there that the more room we can create for the other person to self reflect, the more room that we can create for the other person to consider their own reality, their own situation, the more reality can come into the light and shame dies in the light. So when you have a safe place where somebody can land, then there is the ability for problem solving to practically happen as opposed to performance.
Yeah, and like I had mentioned earlier, I something that kept me hiding was that I was afraid some women in my church would tell me what I didn't want to hear, what I wasn't
Mm.
ready for. And yeah, in this place where she was curious, she let me self reflect, then I felt safe to bring things up because I trust that she's just going to hold it and she's
Mm.
not going to tell me what I have to do. Yeah, she was
Yeah.
just curious
Yeah.
and just creating an open space to just let me be, and I was able to walk out of it when I was ready. Yeah, not that she
Yeah.
ever approved of it, but then I felt
Yeah.
safe enough to figure it out.
Not that she ever approved of it. I think that's a really important statement that you're making just there, because the old model of educating is if somebody makes a mistake, it's punishment. And what we all know in our own personal experiences is that when we have made a mistake, not only as adults, in our youth as well, that fear of punishment didn't prevent us from making the mistake necessarily again, but it did prevent us from seeking support. So I think just exploring that grace for our own selves and exploring seeking safe communities where we can find our way back to, because in a safe place, when you do feel supported, then there's safety to look at our own values, look at our own sense of identity and our own created identity and find our way back there without being blocked by the weight of, okay, this is it. I'm stuck. This is the only way that I can survive right now, as opposed to being empowered and having the ability to navigate and create your own reality again. And I think there's something that's so powerful around what you mentioned there about the fear of judgment in your church community with some of the people in the church community. And I think it's important that we pause and recognize that so many people do have a church wound, whether it's perception of the structure and the organization itself or the religious structure itself, whether it's even a wound from their own community, the moral values of their own community. I have to behave and look and walk and talk a certain way or I'll be ostracized. So many people have a church wound, a community wound, a family wound, an enmeshment wound that says if I don't walk, talk, look, act a certain way, I will be abandoned. And I
Mm,
think what's so important around your experience and how faith helped you to acknowledge and step into accountability, self growth, healing, repair, and really moving away from that stuck place is not, okay, there was a system that I followed and I picked up my Bible one day and I told myself off and got along with it.
mm,
Whether it is through your faith community, whether it's through your local community, your friendship community, please know that there are safe places that you can go. And if there is a fear of judgment and if there is shame blocking you from seeking support, know that there are absolutely people, community, places. If you have a church wound, but you still have a strong relationship with faith and there is that fear, don't feel shackled to one location, one person, one group of people. That's never what grace was ever meant to be about. And I say grace in relationship to faith as a person of faith, but also grace in relationship to community with others, spirituality, whatever your relationship is with something bigger than yourself, even if it is just a larger community, hold space for the fact that shame dies in the light. And when shame dies and you have the ability to experience holding space for that curiosity, that's where true growth, healing, and embracing who you really are, your true identity, not your enmeshment with your perception of your mistakes or other people's perceptions of who you are. That's where that relationship can truly happen. And that's what other relationships are based on, our relationships with our own self. Our relationships with others really should always be a playground and a reflection of our own relationship with our own self. How much grace can we hold for our own selves? How much room for discomfort? How much curiosity and play and connection do we have with our own relationship between our internal parts? So I would love to hear from you what you found in terms of building a new community and building a new way of seeking support and moving forward into grace and true repair with your own self, but also what you wanted your future to look like in a real, true sense, moving away from performance, people pleasing, or any of those other patterns that can create these dynamics whereby we feel that conflict between the way that the choices that we're making maybe and who we believe we actually are.
Mhm. Yeah, it started for me it started for me with my Bible and my journal and going back to connecting with myself and really asking, "Who does Jesus say that I am?" I said that I asked that basic identity question of, "Who am
Mm,
I?" And so I was able to find that in scripture. For example, John 8, there's the example of Jesus and his interaction with a woman caught in adultery. Imagine that. The story is
mm,
actually in the Bible. And so there were a couple different passages like that just wrecked me in the best way possible and helped to rebuild that connection, me with myself and then me with Jesus. And
mm,
so then I started to go outside of that. There were a few specific friends that we told what had happened. Like our pastor at church, during that whole season, we had switched to a different church just because of location. Like you said, you're not shackled to one specific
mhm,
location. And so that was also helpful to just be with some different people. So, had some different friends at this time that I could talk with. And also, I continued to pursue my own healing with some coaches. So, like I mentioned, counseling and therapy was a piece of it. And also, I started to look into coaches who had different specialties, different focus, different ways of healing and working with women. And so, those were some really safe spaces for me. And then, as I became a little more grounded, a little more healed, you would totally understand once your sense of safety comes back, then your creativity comes online. And so for me, that's actually when I started the podcast. I was not all about let me broadcast my story to all of my local friends, but I knew that people in my local world, they don't listen to tons of podcasts and they're not going to be searching for an infidelity one. And so even going public with my story through a podcast, through an Instagram page, it felt safe and it felt like I was creating community to say, "Hey, I can get my story out to the world," because I remember how alone I felt in that moment of doing the Google search and there was no resources for me. And so I remember how alone I felt, and I never want another woman to feel that way. So it was like I didn't have an immediate community. And so I wanted to go create that. Would you believe that just other women have come out of the woodwork and raised their hands and said, "Yeah, me too. I thought I was the only one. Thank you for sharing your story because
mm.
I I didn't know that there were other people like me out there." And so while it is still a very private thing. Like, of course, these stories are very heavy, still very private as women. Some women come to me and they are still in the affair, trying to figure out how to take first steps out. So, building community in that sense can be tricky when lots of women are still navigating it alone. But man, even if it's just that one on one connection to say, if somebody else can see me and hold my story and help me navigate next steps, man, like that's enough community for women to at least get started
Yeah,
with, what could be a conversation that could change their life. So,
yeah.
yeah, so a little local community. And then I've just been intentional to seek it out and create my own when there wasn't any.
I love that. I had a couple of last questions for you. One of them is something that I have been asked, but almost people don't want to ask because it feels a little, "Oh, should I ask that?" So whenever I feel that, I think, oh, if I'm thinking it, I know that there are going to be others
Yeah.
who are curious as well. Something that I've been asked in the past is, how does your partner feel about your work around this, about this being such a big part of your reality now? It used to be something that was only you knew about, and now absolutely it's become your blessing, it's become your calling to be able to support others to move out of those patterns. But how does your husband feel? How do you navigate this? And yeah, what's the reality around that for you and he at the moment? And how have you navigated that?
Yeah, very good question. And it's actually not like a happily ever after answer. So I knew, especially kind of when my 180 took place of confessing and really seriously beginning my healing journey, I knew enough that our healing journeys were going to run in parallel. I was not responsible for how he handled the mess that I just dumped on him, just like he was not responsible for mine. So I was very aware of making choices. This is what I need to do for my healing and my growth. And I sure hope that he comes along with me, but I have to hold that space if he chooses not to. And that's what happened for us. Early on, we did like a marriage retreat and a class. We were in book study and Bible study. We did all of the things for about 6 months. And then, because I know him, I predicted that once that structure was removed, that he might not choose to continue on his healing journey at the same pace that we had been
Mm,
going. And so that's what happened. I saw that drop off and I had to check myself to say this is not a comparison, this is not a race by any means, but I could just see some of the new habits that I had started that were proof to me that there had been real transformation in my life. And okay, I'm going to continue on this journey. And then if he chooses to keep reading the books or listening to the podcasts or going to counseling or whatever, that's 100% on him. I can
mhm,
ask him and I can invite him into those spaces, and I can also give him the option of saying yes or no. Does he wanna engage or not?
mhm,
So, fast forward even to today, yeah, we're in a really interesting spot right now of navigating that separation of, "Hey, you haven't been doing the work, and I've really asked you to do that, and so now what do we do?" And so he might know, like, so as an example of our disconnect all along, I'm not sure that he actually knows all the work that I do. I think he knows I do something, but
mm,
it's one of those things of he never asked, and so I've just continued to move right along. So I definitely handle the story with all respect for him and his journey, but there is a little piece of bummer for me to say, "Man, yeah, it would have been cool to have him, like, on board and supporting and cheering
mm,
me on," and we're just not in that space. So
yeah.
I had to stay true to myself no matter what was going on around me.
Yeah, and your unique individual journey of what that reality looked like for you, and to
Mhm.
be continued. It sounds like it's an ongoing
Yeah.
journey for you both as co-parents and, yeah, your relationship in terms of what that's gonna look like as this evolves. So, I really
Mhm.
wanna thank you so much for
Yeah.
holding space for such a rich topic, such a topic that so many of us have so many questions about in terms of the complexity around the nuance of everything that's involved. It's as I said at the start, it's a sticky subject. And what I'd like to repeat as well is that shame dies in the light. And what you have shown us is that not only does shame die in the light, but sometimes the toughest moments in our life really are the catalyst to moving into bravery, authenticity, kindness, compassion, grace, most importantly, and faith. And I'm so excited to continue following you and exploring what that looks like. I know that there's only going to be amazing things that continue to happen from here. And I feel very blessed to be able to hold this space for you and explore such a complex topic. And I hope that people who are listening to this, no matter what side of the fence that they've been on or how infidelity may have touched them in the past, this helps for them to have self compassion, helps them to maybe see things a little bit differently in terms of the possibilities of where to go, and also hold space for the importance of our relationship with ourselves so that no matter what others do or maybe the ways others haven't supported us, this is a beautiful moment in time to say there are spaces that you can go to where that support is there, and it's a gift that not only you give yourself by seeking and holding space for curiosity and support, but the gift that we give others as well. So So thank you so much for your bravery. I had a couple of last questions for you. The first question I would like to ask is something that I ask my guests to do is leave a question for the next podcast guest after them. And the last question that was left by my last podcast guest is, what are the last one or two triggers that you can turn into deeper connection with yourself or others?
That's a good one. I'm trying to think of an example of my last couple triggers. Yes, one practical example would even be around for me personally, around the idea of no contact with the affair partner. That is probably the number one conversation that I have with women. And yeah, so even being triggered of if I see this person's name or, oh, did I forget to block them on email or this social media platform or whatever. And so the way that, yeah, that I've been able to come back home to myself, even in that of just how am I doing? How am I doing with still continuing to live in my values of, and I could go on a whole thing about this, but we had talked earlier about becoming aware so that we don't repeat the same patterns again and again and again.
Mhm.
And coming home to myself, using that trigger in a way to, like a flashlight, you use the trigger like a flashlight to look in and say, what's the appeal there? Hey, this is an opportunity for me to connect with myself. How am I doing? Is there a part of me that's raising their hand and saying, hey, we need something? How can I get that need met in a healthy way? And the reason I use the word home is just I think of tending to my own home. Nobody
Mm.
else is going to take care of my home for me. I get to do that. That's a privilege that I have to care for a space that is mine. And yeah, so that's really important to once in a while pause, self-reflect and say, "Hey, there's no judgment that I was triggered by whatever it was. No judgment at all, but that curiosity to say, what is this telling me? Why was I provoked by that?" And yeah, just getting really curious and then looking inward. No shame, no judgment, but what can I learn from it?
I love that. That's really beautiful. And I would also like to ask you, what question would you leave for my next podcast guest?
I It's so funny not knowing who your next guest is going to be. I'm thinking if they have any knowledge around this, just what are some really practical tools for your listeners as far as like nervous system and grounding? And I know that those are some of the kind of really big buzzwords these days. But even going back to that trigger idea, what are some of the in the moment tools that they would recommend for coming back home to yourself?
That's beautiful. I love that. That's a really powerful question. And so, what I also do is ask that question to you. What are some really powerful, practical tools that you use for nervous system grounding in the moment to come home to
Mm,
yourself?
yeah. Yeah. You've probably seen me do this quite a few times, but hand on my heart is one of my favorites for sure. I can be with my body because for so long I was all up in my head. I was not aware that I had a body down below my head. So yeah, so staying right here is really important to me. One thing that has also helped on my journey is spending at least 1 minute or 2 minutes a day just in some silence and stillness. And so if that can be, I'm gonna be quiet and I'm gonna close my eyes and just sit. And then for me personally, that also means inviting Jesus into the space. Like I said, that's a very important relationship to me. And so inviting him in and just being quiet doesn't mean I'm praying, doesn't mean I'm journaling, none of that, just being. So to combat my natural tendency of doing all day long, can I take a minute and just be? Sometimes that's sitting still and closing my eyes. Sometimes in the middle of my work day, it means just going outside and looking at the green trees and the blue sky and getting outside. So, yeah, so those are a couple of my favorites. Returning to my body and then taking a couple minutes to just take a deep breath and be.
I love that. That's really beautiful. Thank you so much for coming on to the podcast, Kristina. I would love to share with the audience where they can find you, where they can follow along. Where can our listeners come and join you and hang out more in the future?
So the podcast that they can find is called Intimacy After Infidelity. And then Instagram, I'm on there all the time at Kristina Joy Coaching, Kristina with a K. And yes, I'm an open book. So if they have additional questions or want to share their story, I would love to be able to hold space for them as well. So they're welcome to message me. Yeah, Instagram's probably the easiest place to find me. And yeah, message me anytime.
Beautiful. We'll make sure we pop your links in the show notes. And thank you again, Kristina, for coming and joining us on the Connection podcast.
It's been a joy. Thank you.